Hey, welcome back to the channel, and welcome to Centralia, Pennsylvania, a ghost town right in the heart of Pennsylvania coal country. And it's hard to believe, looking at the abandoned streets behind me, but this was once a thriving mining town filled with families, and buildings, and stores and businesses. But now, as you can see, it's essentially a smoldering, abandoned wasteland. So I thought today we could explore how this once full-of-life town ultimately fell victim to an underground fire that started in 1962, and all the bureaucracy and red tape that went along with trying to extinguish it, that resulted in what we see today, which is essentially the forced relocation of nearly every resident in the town and the subsequent demolition of the town itself. So let's get this show on the road, get talking, and see what we can find. So the history of this area can be dated back to the 1770s, when early settlers surveyed the land as part of the expansion west and the eventual building of the Reading Road, which became Route 61, which still actually runs through town here today. In the early 1790s, a man named Robert Morris, who was actually a key figure in the American Revolution, and I believe a signer of the Declaration of Independence, originally owned this land here. However, that tenure was short-lived when he ended up a few years later declaring bankruptcy, losing the land, and actually ending up in debtor's prison himself. And a few years later, in 1832, a man named Jonathan Faust built an unauthorized, unapproved tavern right along Reading Road here. And so that is the first beginnings of a settlement, I guess, if you will, that ultimately became Centralia. And so you're going to see as we're walking around today and talking, just remnants everywhere on these streets here of what used to be. And so about a decade later, after the Bull's Head Tavern was built, the Locust Mountain Coal and Iron Company bought up the land with the hopes of eventually building a mine in the area here. And so the Locust Mountain Coal and Iron Company brought in a mining engineer named Alexander Rae to come and start laying out the designs for the town that would eventually become the town of Centralia. And so there was modest growth here. People started settling a little bit in the lands in the hills around the area here, but it wasn't until 1854 when the first railroad was built that came through town here that would allow coal to be more efficiently and in large quantities exported, kind of transported out of the area here. And over the next 10 years, 4 other mines and mining companies opened mines in the area as well. And so in 1865, a second railroad was built here to help transport freight and passengers. And so the reason I picked this area here at the moment to talk about this is because we're actually on a road. God, it is, look at this. These used to be streets that went through here. I mean, we can get into this. We'll get into that a little bit later. But the reason I picked this area here is because we are actually on Railroad Avenue, which was the avenue that the freight and passenger rail came right through starting in 1865. And so you can actually see that here with this, where you see the 2 lanes here with a center sort of median along the middle here, and this is where the railroad would have ultimately gone and would have come right down the center between these 2 lanes here, splitting the road, crossing over Locust Street out there, and then heading off east. And so for the next 30-40 years, Centralia saw a significant amount of economic success and economic growth through the expansion and development of coal in the area around here. And so that economic success continued in the coming decades until the town peaked around 1890, 1900 or so, with over 2,700 residents and a thriving town filled with tons of saloons, stores, and churches. However, just a few years later, starting with World War I, the town started to see its slow decline. Miners were taken from the mines and sent to the front lines as part of the battle in World War I. And then the Great Depression several years later hit the town really hard. Mine companies began closing up their mines. People started leaving. And so by the 1960s, Centralia had been in a slow economic decline for nearly half a century. However, it wasn't until a fire began in 1962 that everything ultimately unraveled for the town completely. So the town's original landfill was actually in an area behind the St. Ignatius Church, which is just on the other side of Locust Street. However, due to new regulations passed in the 1950s around how waste was treated, the town was forced to close that landfill, and they didn't open a new one. And over the coming years, with no official landfill, there were upwards of 8 illegal landfills that popped up in the area around here. And so in early 1962, in order to combat all of these dump sites around the area, the town approved the creation of a new official formal landfill actually in the area right behind me over here. And so over the first half of 1962, all of the illegal dump sites were all collected and everything was dumped and added into this new landfill that was created out of an old strip mine back here. So the town had a tradition every year of doing an annual burn of their landfills in order to compact the trash and all of that. And they did that over Memorial Day weekend. And so with this new landfill being created, they decided in 1962 that it would be a great way to sort of christen the new landfill. And so they decided they were going to once again start up the tradition and do a burn over here. And so in May 27th, 1962, Memorial Day weekend, the local fire department ignited a controlled fire like they had done for decades before, and then the firefighters doused the flames that night. A few days later, they noticed the flames had come back, and so they doused it again. A few weeks later, I believe, the flames returned again, and they doused it again. And so what they finally decided to do was to churn up all of the contents of the landfill in order to try to get any of the smoldering material underneath that may still be ignited and causing the flames to return. And so it was with that churning that they discovered a large 15-foot hole in the side of the wall of the dump site that led directly into one of the old mine shafts. And so it's generally accepted that that large hole on the side of the wall allowed the flames from the controlled burn to enter into the old mine shafts and ignite a seam of coal underneath the town, which started the burn that led to the demise of Centralia. What ultimately followed was a series of failed attempts to extinguish the fire. Just a few months later, in August of 1962, after every attempt they had made failed, state and local officials met with local mine representatives and the community to discuss and propose possible options and plans. And so through their initial set of proposals that were meant to help the issue and solve the problem, they actually made things worse. So things like exploratory boreholes that were meant to locate the edges of the fire actually fed and allowed more oxygen to be fed into the flames and into the fire itself, making things worse unintentionally. And so what we have here are a couple of ventilation shafts, which were one of the many solutions that were attempted. The idea was, if you could give the fire a way to vent its gases in a controlled manner, maybe it would keep things sort of under control. So until a few decades ago, these were just steaming with smoke and steam and gases coming from the original fire. So by the mid-1960s, the fire was spreading uncontrollably with efforts like trenching and flushing the area with water and rock, all ultimately failing due to funding running out and water lines freezing due to harsh winter weather. And so the fire continued to burn deeper and deeper and spread out farther, closer and closer to the town. And by 1969, it was decided that a controversial method of installing a fly ash barrier would be used in order to see if that could get the fire under control. So that started in 1962. It took them 5 years to complete the project. So 1974 was completed. However, officials knew by 1972 that the fire had already breached the trenches that they had built. And yet they continued on with the fire, or they continued on with the project and with the barriers, knowing full well that it had already failed. And then by the time it was installed, based on seemingly nothing and arguably contradictory information, officials declared the method a success. They declared the fire under control and sort of washed their hands of it and said, we're good to go. All the while that this was going on, steam was continuing to rise throughout the town, toxic gases were being detected, even in people's houses, causing illnesses and just a general sense of sort of unwell with a lot of the citizens in the area, knowing full well that the government claiming that the fly ash barriers were effective was not true at all. People had firsthand experience of that not being the case.
Well, I live here all alone, and naturally I'm scared. Because, as I say, when you go to bed at night, you don't know whether you're getting up the next morning. And it is scary. And when I'm here in the day and the monitor goes off, I feel like I'm going to take a heart attack. Well, I was advised to get a parakeet. And, of course, I call it Beauty. Just in case there's high gas readings, the bird would get sick or die, and you'd know it was too dangerous to live in the house.
However, the government was not willing to do anything about it until a series of events starting in 1979 made action by the government unavoidable. So just down the road from the origin site of the fire sits this vacant lot here, which is the site of the former Coddington's gas station, owned by John Coddington and his family, who also lived on site here. And so on the morning of November 21st, 1979, John noticed steam coming from the ground in a vacant lot next to his gas station here. And a few days later, it was measured. The temperature was measured at 122 degrees. A few weeks later, he noticed steam coming from the basement of his own floor in the gas station itself, which was measured at 136 degrees. And obviously that was concerning, considering there were gas tanks buried underneath that very ground there with 9,000 gallons worth of gas that could very easily explode. And so the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Resources were called in to start monitoring the situation. And it was very quickly determined that the gas itself was also increasing in temperature, which resulted in the state fire marshal demanding that the tanks be emptied and filled with water in order to prevent an explosion. So in early December of 1979, the first real casualty of the fire here in Centralia happened with the town's only gas station being shut down. It's kind of interesting to note that a few years later, John was actually rushed to the hospital after gases had seeped into their temporary housing, causing him to have a bit of a health issue, from which he ultimately recovered from, but John couldn't seem to escape the fire. And so let's walk down some of these former residential streets here now, which, I mean, they barely even count as a back road. So arguably the most dramatic event that pushed the town and pushed government officials into having to actually act occurred on Valentine's Day in 1981. 12-year-old Tom Domboski, who lived with his grandmother at the time, was asked by his grandmother to go out and basically spy on some local officials who were in town that day inspecting the situation going on in Centralia. And so when Tom ran outside, he was distracted by steam coming from his grandmother's yard. And so when he went over to check out the steam, instead of what the officials were doing, a giant sinkhole opened and took Tom with it. Now Tom was lucky enough to grab onto a tree root and keep himself from falling in, but government officials were right around the corner, were called to the scene to check it out, and got to see firsthand what people were talking about, the impacts of this fire and the dangers that were happening. And so this event, even though Tom ultimately survived, the nature of this event, obviously as terrifying as it is, thrust Centralia into the national spotlight, which left government officials no choice but to have to act. This is crazy. It looks like I'm just walking on a nature trail, and these were old streets. By the end of that year in 1981, 29 families were approved for relocation assistance and were offered buyouts of their current homes, as well as assistance in getting relocated in nearby towns.
The Buckleys are one of 27 families who lost their home to the mine fire. Both Mrs. Buckley and her daughter Shannon suffered chronic respiratory ailments, which they blame in part on the gases in their home.
Yeah, at the beginning, I sort of had to take the factors of my family's health. And it really broke my heart and killed me to give up my home. But when it comes between my home and my family, I had to have a choice there. So I did move. That's the only reason I did move.
We had put all our money into it. Jim's mother passed away. We put that into it, which hurt him very deeply. To put all that money into the home, to remodel it, to make it that it's comfortable for us. And then a few, not even 2 years later, to find out that we were going to have to be moved out of it. We had signed an agreement with the government. But when the time came, we saw what we were getting for the home was $11,000, which people thought we were getting a lot of money. It was supposed to be, it's worth $36,000, but we were offered $11,000 for it. They took off depreciation for this and that, and you ended up with that, and you took it or you stayed there. And we definitely couldn't stay.
Additionally, a now large-scale, comprehensive, and totally exhaustive, if you can call it that, study was approved and started in motion to determine once and for all the extent of the fire and to come up with a plan, no matter how extreme, to address it and get it under control, if not put out entirely. Given the situation with Coddington's gas station and then Todd Domboski and the sinkhole, fear was at an all-time high in town here. The town was divided depending on largely where you were geographically, as the fire was located on the east side of the town, had not impacted the west side as much, and all the while this fire was burning underground and under their own feet and creeping closer and closer and closer to them.
I think the fire has done more to tear this community apart than anything else in the history of the town. I think the community has been torn apart with people fighting against each other, so far as brother against brother and sister against sister and things of this nature. There's no words to describe the kind of problems that exist in the town today. If someone from the outside would look in, it's not as easy to figure the situation out. You have to almost live in this town to realize what these people are doing to each other or the fire actually is doing to them. It has created many problems that will never come out. People don't talk to each other, or people fight with each other. At one time it was a very close-knit community. Today it's far from it.
So with chaos and fear at an all-time high, like I mentioned, in town here, and people fighting against one another, it was ultimately determined in the spring of 1983 to hold a Unity Day. And at first it worked. It calmed people down, it brought people together, it reminded people of the camaraderie that they felt amongst each other as a community. And the town, at least from a mental state, seemed to be turning the page a little bit. However, that was short-lived when just a few months later, the results of the study were returned. And it was determined that in order to fully contain the fire, it would cost something in the neighborhood of $660 million. It would also require the digging of something like a 400-foot deep trench right through the middle of town, which would obviously then result in the necessary destruction of a lot of the buildings in town there. And who knows what that would look like from a logistics standpoint, from a functionality standpoint, with a giant hole being dug right through the middle of town. So obviously that was not possible. And so that news was arguably the straw that broke the camel's back for the town. With the town meeting being held to discuss these results a few weeks later, an overwhelming vote of 2-1 was taken in favor of essentially closing up shop and relocating everyone. You would think with that type of support that the drama would essentially be over with, right? And then it's just time for figuring out the logistics of how to do that. But after the US Congress approved $42 million for the relocation efforts of the town residents, there was still infighting and pushback from people who didn't want to leave their hometown, who still thought that there was not an issue worth leaving for. And so the drama continued through the 80s, where essentially relocations happened on a voluntary basis. When someone decided to relocate, they would essentially notify the authorities. People were brought in, an assessment would be made to the house, an offer would be made, and if you accepted it, they would help you move and board up your house, mark it for demolition, and then when enough of these row houses were abandoned, they would bring a wrecking crew in and demolish the whole lot of them. But this happened systematically, and so you would have a scenario where you'd go down a street and you'd have abandoned house, still person living there, abandoned house, boarded up, which obviously was not good optics. I'm sure it just was not a very positive place to be in. And so by the early 1990s, there were only a handful of residents here still left in the area who had not voluntarily chosen to relocate. And so in 1993, I believe, the governor of Pennsylvania at the time took ownership of all the remaining buildings and property in the land here by eminent domain, and essentially started the eviction process for forcibly kicking out the rest of the people who lived in town here. However, as is never the end of the story with Centralia, the remaining residents fought tooth and nail to stay in their homes, litigated the issue in court for years and years and years, until finally, 20 years later, in 2013, it was ultimately decided that the last few remaining residents in town here could stay, but they were not allowed to sell their property. They were not allowed to transfer ownership of the property to anyone. They essentially were allowed to stay in as long as for the remainder of their life, and as soon as they died, the property immediately became property, I guess, of the state of Pennsylvania. And as of a few years ago, and this is 2024 at the moment, there were supposedly 5 residents left. I feel like there's even less now, possibly. I think there's only 2 houses, maybe 3 here. But yeah, everything else, with the exception of 2 buildings, have all been completely demolished. As we've seen walking through these old, overgrown streets here, I mean, there's nothing left. The rails have all been pulled up. The houses have all been demolished. There's nothing left of this area. And kind of like Daniel's, you need to know what you're looking for and need to know the story to understand sort of what's happening here. And how this town was basically wiped off the map. But now, over 60 years later, there's still a fire burning underneath the town here and underneath the area. And it's expected to burn for another 200 to 250 years at least. And as of a decade or 2 ago, the majority of the steam and gases and things around the town itself here have all but sort of stopped. The ventilation shafts that used to emit steam and smoke 24 hours a day no longer really do, and you're not seeing steam coming up through the ground like some crazy apocalyptic scene anymore. However, as of a few years ago, I believe, way on the east side, about a mile east of town here, new vents, steam and smoke were discovered from the fire. So it's apparently burning east here. So as we walk along this way, kind of up the road from the main intersection right along Route 61 here, we're going to come across arguably what once was the biggest tourist attraction in the area, which is the Graffiti Highway. The Graffiti Highway is a stretch of Route 61 here that used to go straight through. Like, this road used to go straight through here instead of kinking off to the side like it is. However, in 1993, it was determined that a mile-long stretch of the road had to be closed due to extreme buckling and damage caused by the fire. And so it was thought to be temporary while they fixed the road, and ultimately they just closed it for good. And so right across the street here is where the origin of the fire happened. And until 2020, you could walk along it covered in graffiti. It was a cool little thing to see, but I don't think government officials really liked it very much. And so in 2020, they actually covered it with big mounds of dirt. And so I was here 3 years ago, shortly after that had happened, and it looked really awkward. I'll see if maybe some footage that I got from then kind of works in this. But it didn't really cover the ground all that much. It just looked like little patches here and there. But now I kind of get what they were doing, in that I think when the rain fell and you get rain and snow and moisture and all that, it sort of flattens out a lot of the dirt and covers it a little bit more. And so now you can see even less and less of it. But when you're coming into town here from the south, from Ashland, you hit this really awkward kink in the road to the right. That's almost a 90-degree turn out of nowhere. And then you go up alongside of Route 61, and then you kink back to the left and then to the right to rejoin it again. And it's right there where they just shut down the road, put a temporary road in place that ultimately became the permanent road. I don't know what this area looks like once everyone is gone and they've demolished everything. I would think if they had plans to do something with it, they would have started now. I'm venturing to guess they're not waiting for the 2 to 3 random houses to be gone before they do something. So I'm guessing this area is just going to sit like this indefinitely. They might not even demolish the houses, come to think of it, unless vandalism starts taking over a little bit. So what do you say we go and kind of check out a few of the buildings that are still here that I mentioned? Just do kind of a drive through really quick, and then maybe let's head over east of here about a mile to see how hard it is to go trekking into the woods to see if we can find that recent steam vent that has supposedly cropped up in the last couple of years. And so right there is actually the railroad avenue that we looked at earlier. And isn't it amazing how busy this road is, running right through the middle of a ghost town? But this here is the Municipal Building that I was talking about, where on August 11th, 1983, the town officially voted to close up shop and relocate. I don't know that the Municipal Building part of this is even used anymore. There's, I think, a couple of fire engines in here. But one interesting thing to note about this is you can see the writing on the wall here, something's missing. Until a few years ago, that actually said the borough of Centralia. But I'm assuming, I don't know if it was on purpose or what, but just as sort of a representation of what's happening with the town itself, the town is essentially just being sort of eliminated and wiped out of, like, wiped out of the history books almost in a way. But just how out of place does this look as a relatively decently or in decent shape building? Centralia Borough Police, there is no Centralia Police Department. That part of the building just kind of looks abandoned. I'm wondering if it's like offices or some kind of administrative stuff for the fire department itself, but yeah, what was once the municipal building for the borough of Centralia is now just the municipal building. And so up on the hill, up over here, we'll go check out the Ukrainian Orthodox church. It's one of the few buildings that ended up not needing to be demolished because it was built on bedrock and not coal. And it's still active, as there are a lot of members from different communities other than Centralia that still make the trek up here. And old members of Centralia that have been relocated, or residents that have been relocated around the area, still come back to come to church here. So this is that church that we've been seeing from the other side of town. However, they are clearly, they've had enough of dealing with people and tourists and things like that coming through, given those signs that they have up there. Basically just leave us alone, as I think is the general attitude for most of the residents in the area now, which was leave us alone, just let me kind of live out the rest of my life here, has now almost been we will leave them to it. Just know that this is one of the last places that's left. All right, let's go for a little drive and see how difficult it is to go walking through the woods and see if we can find that active vent. All right, I do not have high hopes for this, but we are on back road up here, and we're gonna see if we can find where there's apparently an active vent still, or at least active smoke and steam and stuff coming up. So this all looks like the area that I'm looking for. Is it this? I mean, this looks right. Let's see, is this? Oh, wow. Yeah, okay. So, that is insanely hot. Wow. Okay, so we found it. So this is still remnants and proof of the fire that started 60 years ago underground here. The camera doesn't really pick it up, but you can see. So look, all this is wet here. Wow, that's crazy. You get, that is so hot and so, that's wild. Okay, we're like a mile and a half east of where the fire started. Can you get, like, will it? No, so there's no visible anything, but yeah, that, God, I wish you guys could, whew, it's even starting to steam up. It's even starting to steam up the camera a little bit. Okay, well, there we go. This fire is still going on. It was said that it was going to go on for several hundred years, And it is, it's still slowly spreading out here. I mean, if you want to come and find and experience a bit of active history, it's a 5-second walk off the road here. You just have to know where to go. I think we're going to call it for today's video. If you like this sort of thing, you know, like bugs in your face when you're trying to close things out, feel free to hit the like button, subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you do, hit the little bell. We'll give you notifications when I upload again. Yeah, until next time, I will see you in the next video. All right, bye. It's like your parents, Jesus, it's steaming up my glasses. That's crazy. It's like your parents tell you to get away from the hot stove. All right, that's it. See ya, bye.